Detroit, Michigan. Winter had hit hard that year. The wind cut through like a blade, and the smoke from old factories mixed with the fog that covered the streets. George Miller, 68, walked with trembling hands tucked inside the pockets of a worn-out coat. His gloves were torn at the fingertips, exposing his skin to the biting cold. Once a legend among mechanics, George was now just another tired face moving through the forgotten avenues of the old steel city. With every step, the hum of distant engines seemed to mock him. It was as if every running motor whispered, "You're no longer needed." George had spent 40 years of his life at Autotech Engineering, a company that watched him grow older beneath the smell of grease and the echo of pistons. But new times had come. Computers, sensors, engineers fresh out of college. One mistake, a simple undiagnosed leak, was all it took for them to accuse him of negligence. No defense, no allies, just silence. That day, he walked out of the building with a cardboard box in his arms and the weight of a lifetime on his shoulders. That morning, he waited for the bus on Jefferson Avenue, eyes fixed on the dirty snow at his feet. The pocket watch he had inherited from his father showed 7:12 a.m. It was the only thing he kept spotless since being fired. Engraved on the lid were the words, "Time doesn't erase a man's worth." George closed his hand around the watch and slipped it back into his coat, holding on to it like a broken promise. Then came a noise, an engine sputtering. Across the street, a luxury Tesla Model S had stopped, smoke pouring from under the hood. Two young men in suits looked lost, helpless. "Damn it, not now!" shouted one, kicking the tire. The other, wearing an ID badge, groaned, "We're late for the presentation. The old models failed again." They were engineers, the kind who thought the world began after the year 2000. George slowly crossed the street, boots sinking in the snow. "Maybe I can help," he said, his voice raspy. The two looked at him, trying not to laugh. "Help? Sir, this is a computer-driven system, not carburetors and wrenches," mocked the younger one. The other added, "You probably fix tractors, right?" George took a slow breath. "An engine is an engine, son. You just have to listen." Their laughter was quick, loud and cruel. The wind didn't hurt as much as those words. Still, he leaned in, lifted the hood and studied the mess. The faint clicking pattern, the smell of burning insulation, the rhythm of the smoke. They told him everything he needed to know. "Coolant lines blocked. You've overfed the inverter," he murmured. They ignored him, calling for roadside assistance instead. But when the vehicle's alarms began blaring, panic broke out. "Shut it down, now!" one yelled. Without hesitation, George pulled an old wrench from his coat, one he'd carried for decades, and disconnected the main feed. Silence. The alarm stopped. The smoke began to fade. The two engineers stared at him, stunned. "Jesus, how did you—" George wiped his hands on his pants and said softly, "I just listened to what it was trying to tell me." Before they could even thank him, another man appeared, white shirt, red tie, and the arrogance of authority. "Mr. Miller," George froze. "Still trying to play hero, huh?" The supervisor's voice was dripping with disdain. "This isn't your world anymore. These systems are too advanced for old romantics with grease under their nails." The younger engineers stood silent, but the man waved them off. "Get in the car. Leave him." The Tesla drove away. George stayed there, alone, standing in the snow. The wind picked up, swirling flakes around his shoulders as he looked down. In the reflection of a shop window, he saw a small, worn-out man, but behind those weary eyes, a faint flame still burned. He gripped the pocket watch once more. The ticking seemed louder now, as if whispering, "It's not over yet." The wind blew hard over the rusted rooftops of Detroit's industrial district. George walked the streets like a man searching for something he'd lost long ago, maybe his pride, maybe his purpose. At the corner of Harrison Avenue, he spotted an old garage, Frank's Auto Garage. The sign hung crooked, and the metallic clang of tools echoed from inside. It was the kind of place that still smelled of grease, sweat, and burnt coffee. the last refuge for men who listened to engines instead of screens. George stopped on the sidewalk watching. A young man, thin and sharp-tongued, was struggling to loosen a stuck bolt under an old pickup truck. "Hey, kid," said George, leaning closer. "Try a little heat. It's too cold to move." The boy glared at him. "You can't just walk in here, old man. We don't need advice." George raised his hands. "Just trying to help." From inside came a deep voice. "Evan, stop yelling and get the part." A large man with grey in his beard and steady eyes stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. It was Frank Harris, the owner. "Who's that?" "Some old guy giving orders," the boy muttered. Frank studied George for a second. "Orders, huh? You from around here?" George hesitated. "Used to be. Worked at Autotech. Long time ago." Frank lifted a brow. "Autotech. I remember those days. Before the robots took over." George smirked. "Yeah, before everything got quiet." Frank nodded toward the shop. "You looking for work?" The question hit like a punch. George looked down. "Just looking for coffee." Frank could read people. He saw something in that man, dignity buried under fatigue. "Come on in. Coffee's on me." And the garage was a mess of parts, oil stains and faded calendars. The smell of burnt oil and time filled the air. George sat on an old wooden stool, eyes wandering over the wall of photographs. Smiling men holding trophies, disassembled engines, vintage cars, memories of a time when work was art. Frank handed him a cup. "Black. No sugar, right?" George nodded. "Thought so. Old-timers never use sugar." They both laughed softly. The silence that followed felt comfortable. Frank sat beside him. "You know, I could use another pair of hands. My boy Evan's smart, but he doesn't listen. Thinks YouTube knows more than experience." George turned the cup in his hands. "Not sure I'd be much help. Haven't touched a real engine in years." "Once a mechanic, always a mechanic," said Frank. "Engines don't forget you. They just wait for you to come back." Across the room, Evan scoffed. "Dad, we don't need help, especially from someone who probably doesn't even know what an ECU is." Frank shot him a look. "Show some respect." But George raised a hand. "He's right. I don't know much about computers, but I do know what makes an engine breathe." A car horn interrupted them. A white van with the logo Henderson Logistics pulled up to the door. A man in a suit jumped out, irritated. "Who's in charge here? My delivery truck broke down halfway through the route. If I don't get it running today, I lose thousands." Frank scratched his beard. "We're short-staffed, sir. It might take a while." "Then make it fast," barked the man, slamming the van door. Evan crouched down and connected a diagnostic scanner. George watched quietly, listening. The sound of the starter made something inside him stir. Familiar, alive. He stepped closer. "Don't force it. That clicking? It's not the starter, it's the solenoid." Evan rolled his eyes. "Here we go again." But Frank said, "Let him try." George knelt, opened the panel, and with calloused hands tightened a loose connector. He turned the key. The engine came alive. A deep, clean roar. The client stared. "Wait, how did he—" Frank smiled. "Experience, my friend. Experience." Evan froze, silent for the first time all day. George stood slowly, wiping his hands. Frank crossed his arms. "Guess the old man's still got it," George smirked. "Guess so." The client left a $100 bill on the counter before driving off. Frank pushed it toward George. "Take it. Don't need it. Take it anyway. Consider it a welcome back to the world." George reluctantly accepted. Outside, the wind rattled the garage sign. He looked up at the cloudy sky and for the first time in years felt something like hope. Behind him, Evan watched in silence, his expression caught between admiration and envy. The old man he'd mocked had just done in minutes what he couldn't do in hours. By mid-afternoon, the winter light had turned golden through the dusty windows of the garage. Frank had left to handle a delivery downtown, leaving George and Evan alone. The silence between them was thick, the kind of silence that carries more judgment than words ever could. Evan was under the hood of a Dodge, his face lit by the glow of a hanging work lamp. George, quietly sweeping the floor, tried to ignore the sideways glances. Finally, Evan broke the silence. "So, what's the deal with you?" George looked up. "Deal? Yeah. Guys like you don't just drop by random garages. You used to work at Autotech, right?" "My dad mentioned it." George nodded. "A long time ago." Evan smirked. "Guess they didn't need you anymore, huh?" The words hit like a hammer. But George didn't react. He just kept sweeping, each stroke slower than the last. Evan pushed again. "You know what I think? The problem with old folks is they can't accept they've been replaced. Times change, man." George leaned on the broom, looking straight at him. "You think knowing how to plug a scanner makes you better?" Evan shrugged. "It makes me faster. Maybe, but not wiser." The young man rolled his eyes. "You sound like one of those guys who hate technology. You probably think everything was better back in the day." George smiled faintly. "No, I think people were better at listening. Now everyone just talks louder." Evan didn't answer. He went back to the car, frustrated. The tension lingered in the air like static before a storm. Later that evening, Frank returned. "How'd it go?" he asked. Evan muttered, "Fine." The old man swept the floor. Frank looked at George, sensing the unease. "Don't mind him," he said softly. "He's good, just got too much pride and not enough patience." George smiled tiredly. "Reminds me of myself, 40 years ago." Frank laughed. "Then maybe you're exactly what he needs." The sound of an approaching vehicle cut their conversation short. A black pickup pulled up, polished, new, expensive. The driver stepped out, tall, wearing a long coat and designer shoes. He looked around, unimpressed. "This the place that fixed the Henderson truck?" Frank nodded. "Yeah, you must be from corporate." The man glanced at George. "You were the one who touched the inverter module?" George hesitated. "Yes." The man frowned. "You bypassed safety protocol. That could have caused a short. We can't afford untrained interference." Evan tried to intervene. "Hey, he fixed it." But the man cut him off. "He's lucky it didn't explode. We don't need nostalgia mechanics here." George straightened up. "I didn't bypass anything. I listened. Your diagnostics misread the fault. The system was clogged." The man raised an eyebrow. "And you figured that out by, what, smelling the smoke?" A quiet laugh escaped Evan's mouth before he caught himself. Frank stepped forward. "Enough! He knows what he's doing." But the corporate man only scoffed. "Sure he does. Next time leave the real work to people trained this century." He tossed a card onto the counter. "If you ever need modern assistance, call that number." He turned and left, slamming the door. The garage fell into silence. George picked up the card and looked at the logo, Henderson Motors. Then he placed it gently in his pocket. Evan tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Frank finally spoke. "Don't let it get to you." George shook his head. "It's fine. That's how the world works now." He looked at his hands, rough, cracked, steady, the hands of a man who'd built things when work meant something. Now they were treated like relics. He grabbed his coat and started toward the door. "Where you going?" Frank asked. George stopped without turning around. "Nowhere special, just need to hear the city again." He stepped outside. The wind howled down the empty streets, carrying the echoes of machines, traffic, and time. And somewhere in that cold Detroit air, George felt the faint heartbeat of purpose, distant but alive. A week passed. The snow kept falling, soft but constant, like time itself refusing to stop. George now spent his mornings at Frank's garage, fixing small things, tightening bolts, adjusting carburetors, reorganizing shelves. He wasn't officially hired. He just showed up every day, quietly, like part of the machinery that refused to rust. Evan tolerated him, barely. He rolled his eyes whenever George gave advice and muttered, "We've got scanners for that." But Frank noticed something the kid didn't. Customers started coming back more often. The work felt steadier, the engines quieter. "Say." There's that Friday morning, a customer burst in, shouting, "My truck just died in the middle of Jefferson Street. I barely got it to start again." Frank looked up. "Bring it in. What's the problem?" "Something with the engine. I deliver groceries. I can't lose another hour." They pushed the truck into the bay. The motor coughed, then fell silent. Evan connected the diagnostic tablet. The screen blinked with lines of data. Error 408. Injector signal failure, he read. Could be the ECU, said Frank. But George stood still, eyes closed, listening. The smell of fuel, the faint echo of compression. He didn't need a screen. He had a lifetime of sound in his ears. He stepped closer. Start it again, he said softly. Evan frowned. It's pointless. The data's right here. Start it, George repeated. The boy sighed and turned the key. The truck sputtered. George leaned forward, head tilted slightly, as if tuning into something no one else could hear. He reached under the hood, tapped a cable, then pulled out a screwdriver. In seconds, he tightened a small connector. Try again. The engine roared. Clean, steady, alive. Everyone froze. Evan stared at the screen. But the system said, George smiled faintly. The system listens to numbers. I listen to rhythm. The customer's jaw dropped. That was incredible. How'd you even... George wiped his hands. Loose ground wire. The scanner can't smell burnt metal. The man laughed and clapped him on the back. You saved my day, sir. He handed Frank a wad of cash and drove off. Frank turned to Evan. Still think scanners know everything? Evan didn't answer. For the first time, he looked at George not with contempt, but with curiosity. Later, as the sun set, Frank poured coffee into 2 mugs. Funny thing, he said, handing one to George. You fixed that truck faster than I've seen anyone fix anything here. George shrugged. Just experience. Experience doesn't move that fast, Frank said, smiling. That was instinct. George didn't respond. He just stared at his reflection in the black coffee, remembering the last time someone had said those words to him. 15 years ago, before everything fell apart. That night, the garage was quiet. Evan was gone, and Frank was counting receipts in the office. George stayed by himself, wiping tools and humming softly. Then he heard it again, a familiar clicking from the corner. The Henderson van, the same one he'd fixed before. Something in the sound wasn't right. He walked over and leaned in. The injector's pulse rhythm was off, barely audible, but enough to tell him someone had tampered with it. He frowned. A loose sensor wire dangled near the ECU, cut clean, deliberately. He stared at it for a long moment, then whispered to himself, somebody doesn't want this engine to run. He glanced toward the window. Outside, a black car idled across the street, headlights off. The shadow of a man sat inside, watching. George tightened the wire, closed the hood quietly and turned off the lights. The hum of the engine faded into silence, but the feeling in his chest didn't. A familiar one. Trouble. Adadi-tind. The next morning came grey and cold. Detroit's streets looked washed out by the fog, as if even the city itself needed a moment to breathe. Inside the garage, George arrived early, as usual. Frank was already there, reading the morning paper. He looked up and smiled. You're here before the coffee again. Either you love this place, or you can't sleep. George replied quietly, maybe both. He hung his coat, poured himself a small cup of coffee, and noticed Evan working under a car. No music this time, no comments, just focused work. When Evan saw him, there was no smirk, no sarcasm, only a nod. A small one, but enough to mean something. A few minutes later, Laura Bennett, the same engineer who had come to the garage weeks earlier with the Henderson van, appeared at the door. She looked different now, calmer, but still sharp. Frank Harris. Right here, he said, stepping forward. Morning, ma'am. She looked past him, spotting George in the back. There you are, she said. I was hoping to find you. George blinked, surprised. Me? Yes. You saved one of our delivery systems. Corporate didn't mention it, but I saw the maintenance report. Whoever fixed that van did what our software couldn't. Evan froze mid-movement, wiping his hands. Frank grinned. Told you he still had it. George shook his head modestly. Just lucky timing, ma'am. Laura crossed her arms. Luck doesn't calibrate sensors. Experience does. She walked deeper into the garage, glancing around. "This place reminds me of where my dad worked when I was a kid, back when machines still had a soul." Frank smiled. "They still do. You just need the right ears to hear them." Laura nodded, then turned to George. "I came to offer you something. Henderson Motors is opening a prototype division, electric and hybrid systems. We could use someone who understands the feel of engines, not just the data." George hesitated. "I'm not sure I fit in those kinds of places anymore." Laura tilted her head. "You'd be surprised how much a place can change when someone like you walks in." She handed him her card. "Think about it. You've got something this city's forgetting fast." Then she smiled, not with politeness, but with genuine respect. And that hit deeper than any applause ever could. After she left, the garage stayed quiet. Frank looked at George. "Well, look at that. Somebody finally remembered your name." George rubbed the card between his fingers. "I don't know, Frank. People like her live in another world." Frank shook his head. "Nah, same world, just different floors. You've been on the ground too long. Time to climb a few steps again." Evan leaned on the fender, crossing his arms. "So you're actually thinking about it?" George shrugged. "Don't know. I'm too old to start over." Evan smirked slightly. "Old men always say that before they prove us wrong." For the first time, George laughed. A real laugh. Rough and short, but honest. And in that moment, something shifted between them. That afternoon, Frank suggested they close early. "Let's grab dinner. My treat." George almost refused, but Frank insisted. "You've been hiding behind these engines long enough. Tonight you eat like a man who still matters." They went to a small diner 2 blocks away, the kind where the waitresses call everyone honey, and the coffee never runs out. The same smell of oil and nostalgia hung in the air. As they ate, Frank looked at him and said, "You know, I've seen guys half your age give up for less. You, on the other hand, you got kicked by life, but you still show up." George smiled, eyes lowered. "Maybe showing up is the only thing I know how to do." Frank leaned back, nodding. "That's the difference between mechanics and engineers. Engineers work for a company. Mechanics work for life." When George walked back home that night, the streets were quiet. The wind had softened. He reached into his coat and pulled out the pocket watch. The ticking was faint, almost fragile, but steady. He whispered to himself, "Maybe time hasn't forgotten me after all." In the reflection of a store window, he saw a tired old man. But this time, his eyes didn't look defeated. They looked awake. It was early Sunday morning. Detroit was quiet, still wrapped in mist and the hum of faraway traffic. George sat at the same diner from the night before, nursing a half-empty cup of coffee. The waitress had stopped asking if he wanted a refill. She just kept pouring it out of habit. He watched the city wake up, delivery trucks, factory workers, and early risers with tired eyes and heavy coats. He used to be one of them. Maybe he still was. The bell over the door rang. Laura Bennett walked in, holding a folder under her arm and scanning the room until her eyes found him. "Mr. Miller," she greeted, sliding into the booth across from him. "You're up early for a Sunday," he said, surprised. "So are you." She placed the folder on the table. "Something happened at Henderson Motors. A test run went wrong last night." George's brow furrowed. "Another system failure?" "Worse. Someone tampered with the hybrid units, the same models you repaired." George felt a chill in his chest. "Sabotage?" She nodded. "We're still investigating, but whoever did it knew exactly what to disable. The entire line could have caught fire if we hadn't shut it down in time." He leaned back, silent for a moment. "And you came to me. Why? Because you're the only one who noticed something was wrong before. The only one who actually listens." George looked out the window, the steam from his coffee fogging the glass. "I'm not part of that company anymore." Laura's tone softened. "You're not. But this isn't about a company, George. It's about people. Workers who could have died." The words lingered. For years he'd tried to distance himself from anything that reminded him of auto tech, of that one day, that one explosion, that one young man who never made it home. But this was different. He rubbed his hands together, the roughness of his skin grounding him. "What do you need me to do?" Laura smiled faintly. "Come to the plant. Take a look. Off the record." By the time they arrived, the Henderson Motors facility was buzzing with tension. Security guards, engineers, and supervisors moved around nervously. The smell of burnt plastic hung in the air. A section of the testing floor was cordoned off with yellow tape. George walked slowly, taking it all in, the scattered tools, the melted wires, the smell of ozone. He knelt beside one of the damaged hybrid engines. "See this?" he said, pointing to a charred fuse. "Someone overrode the voltage limiters manually. This wasn't an accident." Laura crouched beside him. "Can you tell who did it?" He shook his head. "Not yet. But whoever it was, they were careful. Almost too careful." Frank and Evan had followed them in quietly. Evan watched from a distance, impressed by the calm authority that seemed to return to George as he worked. It was as if every second in that space reawakened something in him, the rhythm, the intuition, the purpose. Hours passed as he traced circuits, checked systems, and questioned the younger engineers. Some recognized him, others whispered behind his back, "Isn't that the guy who got fired from Autotech? What's he doing here?" But none of it mattered. George was in his element, listening to the heartbeat of machines and the silence between their pulses. At one point, he looked up and saw Evan standing nearby, watching intently. "Come here," George said. "Hear that?" Evan leaned in, confused. "All I hear is static." "Exactly," said George. "That's the problem. The circuit's voice is gone. When a system goes silent, it's not resting. It's dying." But the young man's expression changed. For the first time, he understood what the old man meant when he said machines talked. Later, Laura approached again. "Any idea what caused it?" George wiped his hands on a rag. "Not yet. But someone wanted this to fail publicly, probably during the next live demo." She frowned. "That's tomorrow. Then we don't have much time." He turned toward the factory floor, where dozens of hybrid engines sat waiting, silent, innocent, and vulnerable. It was then that the weight of the moment hit him. He wasn't there to fix a machine. He was there to protect people, the ones who still believed the system would never betray them. And for the first time in years, he felt it again. That old fire inside, the voice that whispered through the hum of motors and the ticking of his father's watch. The value of a man isn't in what he keeps. It's in what he saves. George looked at Laura. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll be here before the lights come on." But 2 days later, Detroit woke under a grey sky that looked heavy enough to fall. George had barely slept. The ticking of his father's pocket watch seemed louder that morning, each second a reminder that time was moving, and so was destiny. By the time he reached Henderson Motors, reporters and city officials were already gathering near the main gate. It was the day of the public hybrid demonstration, the test that would decide whether the company's new technology was safe for mass production. Dozens of cameras, journalists, and engineers filled the testing area. Everyone was watching, and everyone was nervous. Frank and Evan stood near the garage entrance, their faces tense. "Big day," said Frank. "You ready for this?" George tightened the strap of his worn gloves. "Ready or not, it's here." Evan looked at him. "You sure you're up for it? You don't owe them anything." George gave a half smile. "I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it for what's right." Laura approached, clipboard in hand. "The city's mayor is here. The press is streaming everything live. If this test fails, the entire project dies." "Then it can't fail," George said calmly. The first 2 trucks powered on perfectly, humming like giant heartbeats echoing through the hangar. Applause followed each successful start. But when the third vehicle, the prototype George had repaired himself, was activated, something went wrong. A high-pitched whine cut through the air. Warning lights flashed red on the dashboard, then a mechanical scream. "Kill the power!" shouted one of the engineers. "It's not responding!" another cried. The truck shook violently, smoke hissing from under the hood. The battery's heat indicators shot past critical. Someone yelled, "It's going to blow!" Panic spread. People started backing away. George didn't move. He stepped forward, calm, like a soldier walking into battle for the last time. And tea. Laura grabbed his arm. George, no, it's not safe. He looked at her. Neither is doing nothing. He opened the hood. A blast of hot air hit him in the face. The electrical arcs snapped like lightning. He could feel the vibration of the system, the unstable rhythm, the sound of a machine begging for help. Frank shouted from behind, "What do you need?" "Silence!" George yelled back. Everyone froze, and in that silence, he listened. He reached into the panel, pulled a damaged fuse, and replaced it with a spare he always carried in his coat. The sparks intensified for a second, then stopped. "Try it now," he called out. Evan climbed into the cabin, hands trembling. He pressed the ignition switch. The engine hesitated, once, twice, then roared back to life. The entire hangar erupted in cheers. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing, Laura's eyes filled with tears. "You did it again," she whispered. George stepped back, panting, his hands blackened with soot. "Engines speak," he said, barely audible. "You just have to listen." But as the celebration grew around him, George's knees buckled. Frank caught him before he hit the ground. "Easy, old man," he said, his voice breaking. "You're burning yourself out." George smiled weakly. "I've been burning my whole life. This time, at least, it was for something worth it." Paramedics rushed over. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, the crowd began to applaud again, not for the company, not for the project, but for the man who refused to give up. As he was wheeled away, George looked up at the ceiling of the hangar. For the first time in years, the noise of the world didn't sound cruel, it sounded alive. And somewhere, among the cameras and the flashing lights, a man in a dark suit watched silently, the same one who had mocked George before. He turned to an assistant and muttered, "Find out everything you can about him, because even miracles make enemies." That night, Detroit slept, but George didn't. He sat alone inside the darkened garage, the pocket watch open on the bench before him. The ticking filled the room like a heartbeat. Each sound pulled him backward, to the day everything broke. Smoke, the smell of burning rubber, a man's scream, a burst of light. He could still see it when he closed his eyes. The explosion at Autotech 15 years earlier, the day he lost his job, his family, and the belief that his hands could ever build anything good again. Back then, he was the chief mechanic, respected, trusted. That morning, the plant was running a test on a new line of turbo engines. The investors were there. Everyone was nervous. Then a valve jammed on one of the units. He'd spotted the problem, shouted for them to stop the run, but it was too late. A deafening crack, fire rolling across the floor, a young technician, barely 20, caught in the blast. George reached for him, but the flames reached first. Later, the investigation found a single signature missing from the maintenance log. His. They said he'd ignored safety protocol. He tried to explain, but the company needed someone to blame. And so, George Miller, the man who once taught others how to listen to machines, became the name whispered in shame down every hallway of Autotech. His wife stopped answering the phone. His daughter, Emily, only 14 at the time, watched him pack his things into a cardboard box. "Dad," she had said through tears, "you didn't do it, right?" He couldn't even answer. He just hugged her, holding on to the only part of his life that still felt real. Months later, his wife left, took Emily with her. George didn't blame her, but every empty morning that followed reminded him that guilt is heavier when you believe it might be true. Since then, he carried that watch, his father's watch, as both punishment and prayer. The inscription inside had almost faded. Time doesn't erase a man's worth. It reminds him when it's time to serve again. The door creaked open. Frank stood there, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You still awake?" George shut the watch. "Hard to sleep when the past keeps working overtime." Frank sat down beside him. "You looked like you were somewhere else earlier. Want to talk?" George hesitated, then exhaled. 15 years ago, I was blamed for an accident that killed a kid. They said it was my fault. Maybe it was." Frank frowned. You think you caused it? George shook his head slowly. I think I didn't stop it. And sometimes that's worse. They sat in silence for a while. Then Frank said quietly, maybe the reason you're still here is to stop the next one. The garage door rattled. Evan stepped in, phone in hand. Mr. Miller, you're trending online. George blinked. Trending? Evan held out his phone. A video, the bridge repair, the live test had gone viral. Thousands of comments. The old man who saved Detroit. Real skill never dies. A living legend. Frank laughed. Look at that. You went from scapegoat to hero in one upload. George shook his head. Heroes don't fix machines. They fix people. Evan looked at him, serious now. You fixed me today. George smiled faintly. Then maybe there's still some work left to do. That night, before leaving, he placed the pocket watch on the workbench once more. The ticking was steady, patient, like forgiveness taking its time. He whispered to the dark, if destiny wants it, I'll listen. And somewhere, deep inside the silence, it felt like time finally whispered back. The morning broke calm and bright. The snow had melted a little overnight, leaving the streets damp and shining under the pale sun. For once, the city didn't look tired. George arrived early at the garage, as always. Frank was sitting by the counter, sipping coffee and listening to the radio. Evan was organizing tools, humming softly. It felt like any other morning, until the phone rang. Frank answered. Frank's garage. He listened quietly, his expression changing. When he hung up, he looked at George. That was the mayor's office, he said. They want to see you. Me? George asked. Frank nodded. About what happened on the bridge and the test. They said it's important. George didn't move for a long moment. After years of being ignored, now the world suddenly remembered his name. Frank smiled. Go on, old man. Maybe Destiny's finally knocking again. The city hall was a tall red brick building, its halls smelling of paper and polish. George walked through the corridors slowly, feeling out of place in his grease-stained coat. When he reached the conference room, Laura Bennett and the mayor were waiting. Mr. Miller, said the mayor, shaking his hand warmly. It's an honor. George tried to smile. I'm not sure I've done anything honorable lately. The mayor laughed. The whole city disagrees. Laura opened a folder on the table. Henderson Motors wants to expand the hybrid program. We're creating a training division for technicians, people who can combine traditional skill with modern systems. She looked at him directly. We want you to lead it. George blinked, stunned. Me? I'm not a teacher. Yes, you are, she said gently. You just don't know it yet. He hesitated. For years, he had avoided leadership, avoided being responsible for others. Because the last time he was, someone died. I appreciate it, he said finally, but maybe someone younger. Laura interrupted. Mr. Miller, there's no algorithm for wisdom, and there's no substitute for heart. You have both. The mayor added, this isn't charity, George. It's justice. The city owes you a chance to rebuild what was taken from you. George looked down at the table, his reflection caught in the polished wood. For the first time, he didn't see the man who failed. He saw the man who stayed. He nodded slowly. All right, I'll do it. Outside, Frank's truck waited by the curb. When George stepped out, Frank grinned. Well, they want me to teach, said George. Frank whistled. About damn time. Evan leaned forward from the passenger seat. Are you really going to do it? George looked at him. You think I should? Evan shrugged. You taught me more in 2 days than college did in 2 years. George smiled quietly. He looked up at the grey sky and exhaled, like someone finally letting go of the weight on his chest. Then I guess I should. Later that day, back at the garage, George sat alone at his workbench. He pulled out the pocket watch, tracing the worn engraving with his thumb. The words shimmered faintly in the light. Time doesn't erase a man's worth. It only reminds him when to return to service. He whispered, Guess it's time. Frank appeared at the door. You talking to yourself again? George chuckled. Talking to time. We're finally on the same side. Frank laughed and patted his shoulder. Then let's make sure you don't waste it this time. George smiled, closed the watch and stood up. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running from the past. He was walking towards something. 3 weeks later, the Henderson Motors factory buzzed like a living engine. Journalists, city officials and engineers filled the massive hangar. The air crackled with tension and pride. Today was the day they would prove that Detroit could still build miracles. George stood near the back, his old gloves tucked into his belt, the pocket watch heavy in his coat. Frank and Evan were beside him, both wearing fresh uniforms with the Henderson logo stitched in blue. Laura paced nervously, clutching her clipboard. "You okay?" she asked him. George nodded. "Been through worse." She smiled faintly. "That's what scares me." 3 hybrid trucks stood lined up under the bright industrial lights. Every camera in the building was fixed on them. The mayor stood ready to speak, his voice echoing through the speakers. "Today, we honor not only innovation, but the people who remind us that experience never expires." Applause filled the room. George's heart beat in sync with the ticking of the watch in his pocket. He whispered, "Let's do this." The first truck started flawlessly. A smooth, deep hum filled the hangar. The second truck fired up next. Perfect synchronization, no errors. The crowd began to relax. Then came the third. A sharp metallic whine cut through the air. Red lights flashed. Smoke burst from under the hood. Laura shouted, "Shut it down!" But the system froze. The control panel blinked red and the engineers panicked. "It's overheating. The battery's going critical." People started backing away. Someone yelled, "Get clear!" George didn't move. He grabbed his tools and walked straight toward the chaos. Laura tried to stop him. "George, no, it's unstable." He met her eyes, calm and steady. "So was I once." He climbed onto the front bumper, opened the hood, and was hit with a wave of searing heat. The motor crackled, sparks jumping like lightning across the cables. The smell of burning metal filled his lungs, but his mind went silent, laser-focused. Frank shouted from the distance, "Tell me what you need." "Quiet," George snapped. Everyone froze. The hangar went dead silent, except for the desperate wheeze of the machine. He listened. The rhythm of the short circuit, the pulse of the coolant lines, the struggling breath of the motor, like a man gasping for life. Then he saw it, a damaged module, glowing faintly. Someone had tampered with the voltage regulator. His jaw tightened. "Sabotage," he muttered. He reached deep into the system, sparks biting at his wrists. Frank threw him a spare fuse. "Think it'll work?" George grinned weakly. Only one way to find out. With a twist of his screwdriver, he disconnected the damaged line and patched in the backup fuse. The system screamed, then fell still. "Try it now," he yelled. Evan hit the ignition. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then a deep, steady roar filled the hangar. The third truck came alive, humming perfectly in rhythm with the others. Every gauge turned green. The crowd erupted in cheers. Cameras flashed. Laura covered her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. "You did it," she whispered. George wiped his forehead, his hands trembling. "No," he said quietly. "We did it." But as the applause rose, his legs gave out. He collapsed to one knee, catching himself with a trembling hand. Frank ran to him. "Easy, old man. You're pushing too hard." George smiled faintly, exhausted. "I've been pushing all my life. Might as well end with purpose." The crowd's cheers blurred into a distant hum. The ticking of the watch grew louder in his mind, like time itself clapping for him. Laura knelt beside him. "You saved us all," she said, voice shaking. He looked up at her, eyes bright but tired. "I just listened to what the world was trying to say." As the crowd surrounded them, the mayor raised a hand. "This man just saved the future of Detroit." Applause thundered again, echoing through the hangar. George looked around, the people, the machines, the lights spilling through the skylights, and realized something. For the first time in years, the noise didn't hurt. It sounded like life. He smiled. "Engines talk," he said softly, "but only to those who still believe." The sound of applause still echoed through the hangar when George stumbled. Frank caught him by the arm before he could fall. "Hey, easy there." he said. "You're white as a ghost." George tried to laugh, but the sound came out weak. "It's just the heat, and maybe the years finally catching up." Laura rushed toward them. "He's hurt. Somebody get a medic." George shook his head. "No doctors. Just give me a minute." But a minute turned into silence. His body sagged, the wrench slipping from his hand. The pocket watch hit the floor with a sharp metallic clink, and then everything went black. Busy tin. When George opened his eyes, the world was white. The sterile smell of disinfectant told him exactly where he was. A hospital. Machines beeped softly around him, mimicking the rhythm of the pocket watch that now lay on the bedside table. Evan sat in the corner, head bowed, eyes red from exhaustion. When he saw George stir, he jumped to his feet. "Thank God! You scared the hell out of us." George smiled faintly. "I scare people without trying." "Must be the grey hair." Frank entered next, holding 2 cups of bad coffee. "The doctors say it was exhaustion. You've got to stop saving the world one engine at a time." George turned toward the window. "If I stop, the world falls apart." A nurse came in, adjusted his IV, and left quietly. When the door closed, Laura stepped inside. Her eyes looked different, not the eyes of a boss, but of someone who truly cared. "George, you saved more than a project," she said softly. "You saved lives." He looked at her, tired but kind. "I just did what anyone should have done." She set a folder on the table. "Inside are the final documents. Henderson wants you to head the training center officially." George sighed. "I'm not sure I'm the man for that." Laura crossed her arms. "Yes, you are. Because you're not doing it for glory. You're doing it for truth." Evan nodded. "She's right. You keep saying machines talk. Maybe now it's time you teach others to listen." George smiled faintly, but behind that smile there was pain, not from his body but from memory. He looked down at his trembling hands, the same hands that had once caused tragedy. "Do you really think people can change?" he asked quietly. Frank pulled up a chair. "Change? No, but we can fix what we broke. Isn't that what you've done your whole life?" The room went quiet again, filled only by the sound of the heart monitor. Evan looked at him and said, "You keep fixing everyone else's engines. Maybe now it's time to fix your own." George chuckled softly. "Maybe, but I might need a good mechanic for that." "You've got one," said Evan. The days passed. George stayed in recovery, but his mind wandered far from the hospital walls. He thought of the factory floor, the roar of the engines, the faces of the workers. He thought of Emily, his daughter, and wondered if she'd seen the news. On the 5th day, he received a small package. No sender's name. Inside was a letter, written in neat handwriting. "You don't know me, but my father worked under you at Autotech. He used to say you were the only man who treated machines and people with respect. He never blamed you for what happened. Neither do I. Some things in life break, so others can learn how to rebuild them." George folded the letter carefully and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, his heartbeat felt steady, not because of the machines around him, but because something inside had finally gone quiet. When he was discharged, the world outside looked softer, the air cleaner. Frank waited by the truck, leaning on the door. "Let's get you home," he said. George looked at him. "Where's home, Frank?" Frank smiled. "Wherever the engines still breathe." They drove through Detroit in silence. The city lights blurred against the glass, shimmering like distant stars. "Frank," said George finally, his voice calm, "do you think time forgives?" Frank thought for a moment. "I think time doesn't forgive or forget. It just waits for us to forgive ourselves." George nodded slowly. The pocket watch ticked quietly in his hand, perfectly in rhythm with the hum of the truck's engine. For the first time, both sounds felt the same, alive, patient, and at peace. The mornings had music again, not the kind that came from radios or factory floors, but the kind that came from purpose. Inside the old garage on Harrison Avenue, sunlight cut through the dusty windows, landing on a brand new sign painted in white letters. Miller and Harris, Technical and Human Training Center. George stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, watching the paint dry. He could smell the mix of oil, coffee, and fresh hope in the air. Frank was inside, rearranging toolboxes with his usual gruff cheer. Evan, sleeves rolled up, tuned a small engine while explaining something to a group of young trainees. The garage, his old refuge, had been reborn, just like him. When the first class arrived, the students didn't know what to expect. They were kids from all over, some with grease already on their hands, others with soft palms that had never turned a wrench. But all of them carried the same look in their eyes, that mix of fear and hunger that only new beginnings bring. George stepped forward, quiet but firm. His presence alone calmed the room. He placed a single old carburetor on the workbench. "Here," he said, "is your first teacher." The students exchanged confused looks. One brave kid raised his hand. "What do you mean, sir?" George smiled. "It's broken, but if you listen long enough, it'll tell you why." Laughter filled the room, soft and unsure. But George didn't laugh with them. He waited. Eventually, they fell silent. And in that silence, they began to hear. He walked among them as they worked, teaching not just with words, but with patience. When someone dropped a tool, he'd say, "Don't rush. Machines don't like panic." When a bolt refused to turn, he'd say, "Persuade it, don't fight it." Evan assisted him, guiding the younger ones with the same quiet precision he had learned from George. Frank leaned against the doorway, coffee in hand, grinning. "Look at you," he said. "You turned a junkyard into a classroom." George smiled. "It's not about teaching engines, Frank. It's about reminding people they still matter." A few weeks later, during a break, Laura came by to check on their progress. She stood in the corner, watching the class work, the laughter, the teamwork, the sparks of curiosity flying across the room. When George noticed her, he walked over, wiping his hands. "I think it's working," he said. Laura nodded. "You didn't build a training center, George. You built a sanctuary." He looked around. The smell of oil, the echo of tools, the light filtering through the windows, all of it hummed in harmony. For the first time in decades, he felt complete. Later that afternoon, as the last student left, someone appeared at the doorway. A woman, mid-30s, soft eyes, holding a folder close to her chest. "Dad?" George froze. That voice, older now, but unmistakable. "Emily." She nodded, her smile trembling. "I saw the news. The bridge, the factory. I had to see it for myself." George took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough to touch her face. He hadn't realized he was crying until she reached up and wiped the tears from his cheeks. "You look older," she said gently. He laughed through the tears. "And you look like your mother." They hugged, and for the first time in years, the weight of everything he had lost lifted. No words could have fixed the time they'd missed, but forgiveness didn't need time, only love. That night, George sat alone in the garage, the lights dim. He opened his father's watch and stared at the unmoving hands. He whispered, "I think I understand now. The time never stopped." I did. He closed the watch, placed it back on the bench, and turned off the lights. Outside, the city of Detroit hummed, alive, imperfect, and beautiful. And as he walked home, the faint rhythm of the engines behind him sounded less like machines and more like gratitude. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in Detroit, the kind of day when the air feels lighter and the sun touches everything with a quiet kind of gold. For the first time in decades, the city had something to celebrate. Not a machine, not a product, but a man. The Henderson Motors courtyard was filled with people. Workers, students, engineers, and neighbors gathered shoulder to shoulder. A stage stood in front of the factory gates, framed by banners that read, "Honoring the man who brought Detroit's heart back to life." Behind the stage, George Miller adjusted the collar of his old blue shirt. Frank stood beside him, smoothing down his tie like a proud older brother. "You ready for this?" Frank asked. George gave a nervous chuckle. "Not even close." "Good," Frank said. Means you'll speak like a human instead of a politician. Outside, the crowd quieted as Laura Bennett stepped to the microphone. Her voice carried steady and clear. "Some people fix engines," she said, "but some people fix something far more fragile, the belief that work still matters." Applause rippled through the crowd. "Today we honor a man who showed us that age doesn't mean obsolescence, and that wisdom is not measured in years, but in the lives it touches." She turned, eyes glistening. "Please welcome Mr. George Miller." The sound that followed wasn't just applause. It was gratitude, thunderous, rising, human. George walked to the microphone slowly, the old pocket watch heavy in his palm. When the noise faded, he looked out at the faces before him, young and old, strangers and students, friends and family. For a moment, words refused to come. "I was never good at speeches," he began. A soft laugh moved through the crowd. "I spent my life fixing things, most of them made of metal, some of them made of mistakes." He paused, eyes scanning the audience. "For a long time I thought I was done. That time had erased my worth. But I learned something. Time doesn't erase a man's value. It only asks if he's still willing to serve." Silence. Even the wind seemed to stop. He lifted the pocket watch. "This belonged to my father. He told me, engines will stop, but the good you build in others keeps running." I think I finally understand what he meant. From the front row, Emily watched, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. For years, she had waited to see her father not as the man who fell, but as the man who stood up again. And here he was, not a hero in armor, but in grease and scars and humility. The mayor stepped forward, handing him a golden plaque that read, "In recognition of George Miller, for restoring Detroit's soul through skill, heart, and humanity." As he held it, the crowd rose to their feet. Frank clapped until his hands hurt. Evan, now a teacher himself, whistled from the back. And Laura whispered to herself, "You did it, old man." George smiled, overwhelmed. "I didn't do this alone," he said softly into the mic. "I just reminded people to listen again, to machines, to others, and to themselves." The crowd roared. But George didn't hear the noise as applause anymore. He heard it as rhythm, the rhythm of life finding its balance again. And that evening, long after the ceremony ended, the garage was quiet. George sat at his workbench staring at the plaque. The pocket watch lay beside it, its tick faint but steady. He whispered, "I guess this is what peace sounds like." From the doorway, Emily's voice answered softly, "No, Dad. That's what legacy sounds like." He turned, smiled at her, and nodded. Outside, Detroit glowed beneath the streetlights, alive, grateful, and full of second chances. Months passed. Winter returned to Detroit, but it didn't feel as cold as before. Inside the newly named Miller and Harris Training Center, the hum of learning replaced the old silence of defeat, the sound of young voices, of laughter, of tools clinking. It was the music of a second chance. George still arrived before dawn every morning, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He'd brew a pot of coffee, check the students' workstations, and wait for the first footsteps to echo through the hall. Routine had become purpose, and purpose, peace. One morning, Evan walked in with a camera crew. "What's all this?" George asked, wiping grease from his hands. Evan grinned. "Local news wants to film a piece about the center. They said your stories inspired other cities to open programs like this." George frowned. "You mean they're copying us?" "Learning from us," Evan corrected. "Isn't that the point?" George chuckled. "Maybe so." He let them film, though he never looked straight into the camera. The reporter asked questions about legacy, success, and redemption. He kept his answers simple. "I just teach people to listen, to engines, to others, and sometimes to themselves." Later, as the crew left, a young trainee approached him. "Mr. Miller," the boy said, "my dad used to say you were the best mechanic in Detroit. He said you could hear what engines were feeling." George smiled. "Engines don't feel, son, but the men who build them do." And that night, After everyone had gone home, George stayed behind. He sat at his old wooden desk, the same one that had seen his failures and his rebirth, and opened a small envelope. Inside was a photo. Him, Frank, Evan, Laura, and the first graduating class of the center. On the back, someone had written, "For the man who taught us that broken things aren't the end. They're the beginning." He stared at it for a long time, then placed it next to the pocket watch, the two symbols of his life, time and teaching, side by side. One measured seconds, the other measured meaning. The years began to move differently after that. The old garage became a landmark, a place where generations came to learn the lost art of patience and precision. George's students went on to become engineers, inventors, and teachers themselves. They carried his methods, his sayings, his quiet strength. When he finally retired, no one wanted to believe it. "You can't leave," Evan said. "This place is you." George smiled. "No, this place is yours now. I just kept it warm." He handed Evan the pocket watch, the same one that had once carried the weight of guilt, now light with gratitude. "It's your turn to listen," he said. Evan took it carefully, understanding without words that this wasn't a gift. It was a passing of fire. That evening, George walked alone down Harrison Avenue, his steps slow but certain. The city lights reflected off the snow, and the air smelled faintly of oil and rain. He passed by the shop windows, watching the reflection of a man who had once thought his story was over. Now, he knew, it had only just begun. He whispered to himself, "Destiny isn't something that happens to you. It's something that waits until you're ready to meet it." And as he disappeared into the winter dusk, the lights of the Miller and Harris Training Center stayed on behind him, a beacon for everyone who ever felt left behind. Because legacy isn't what you leave after you're gone. It's what stays alive while you're still here. Years later, Detroit looked different. The factories were quieter, but not dead. They had evolved, electric, efficient, almost silent. But in the silence, you could still hear echoes of the men who once worked with their hands and hearts. In the corner of the Miller and Harris Training Center, now renovated and expanded, a small brass plaque hung by the entrance, dedicated to George Miller, who reminded the world that no one is too old to matter. Every morning, students passed it without fail. Some touched it for luck before class. Others simply looked up and whispered a quiet, "Thank you, Dri." Evan now ran the center. His hair was starting to grey, and the old pocket watch never left his wrist. Whenever a new student joined, he would hold it up and say, "This belonged to the man who taught me that engines don't run on fuel, they run on faith." And somewhere deep in the building, behind a glass case, sat George's old workbench, the same one covered in scratches, oil stains, and tiny notes he'd carved into the wood over the years. "Listen before you fix. Pride ruins what patience can save. Time is not your enemy." They had become lessons as eternal as the hum of an engine, constant, steady, alive. On the outskirts of the city, a quiet cemetery overlooked the river. The wind there always carried the smell of iron and rain. A simple gravestone bore his name, George Miller, 1953-2027. He listened. Emily visited often, bringing her own children now. She would kneel, place a single white rose on the stone and whisper, "You kept your promise, Dad. You found your way back." Sometimes she'd hear the faint sound of an engine turning over somewhere in the distance, and for a moment it felt like he was still there, tuning the rhythm of the world one last time. Nut. As night fell over Detroit, the lights of the training center flickered on. Dozens of students worked late, heads bent over open engines, laughter echoing off the walls. And in that sound, the sound of learning, of persistence, of second chances, George's spirit lingered, because men like him never really disappear. They become part of the hum of the city, part of the memory of every hand that still believes fixing something broken is an act of hope. And if you stood close enough to one of those engines and listened carefully, you could almost hear it, a steady heartbeat beneath the metal. Never let the world tell you you've lost your worth. Sometimes the world just forgets how to measure it. The pocket watch kept ticking, Detroit kept breathing, and destiny, true, quiet, and hard-earned, kept turning its gears.